Hi, I'm Jeff Hajek, the owner and founder of Action. This video is part of my lean training system. It was originally released as a DVD a long time ago, but times have changed and the look of some of these LTS videos is now a bit dated. The content is still spot on though, so rather than just discontinue the line, I am posting the majority of each of the 36 videos here, with the remainder available at Action Videos. That's our video service where you can download a wealth of supporting content and watch subscriber-only videos. I recommend subscribing and hitting the notification button if you want to make sure you don't miss any new content. I would also really appreciate if you would hit the like button if this video is helpful and you want to see more content similar to it. The like button helps us get found on YouTube, but it also lets us figure out where you want us to put our future effort. Now enjoy the free version of this video.
Hello, my name is Jeff Hajek. I am the owner and founder of Action Continuous Improvement. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation on policy deployment. Let's start off by talking about the objectives of this training. First of all, we'll learn about what policy deployment actually is. Secondly, we'll talk about going through the whole policy deployment process. And finally, we'll take a look at the tools you use to support policy deployment. If you are at all familiar with policy deployment, you will know that it is a method of turning strategy into reality. But before we get too far down the path of talking about what to do, let's look first at what not to do. The first of the reasons that strategies fail is that they are done in a top-down manner. That just means that senior leaders decide what to do, and they drop it like a bomb onto their teams. The teams have no input in what the strategy actually is. It's very hard to get behind a strategy when you have no say in it. The second failure mode of strategies is the fire and forget. Senior leaders roll out a strategy and then go on to other things, leaving the frontline teams to implement it on their own. This is seldom effective. An aggressive strategy requires the skills, experience, and resources that senior executives can bring to bear. And even if senior leaders are fully engaged in managing the strategy, they will still be unlikely to succeed if they don't collect facts and data about their progress. Without comparing actual measurements to the plan, it's impossible to tell if the strategy is working. So obviously, if those are the reasons that strategies fail, we're looking for a leadership system that avoids those pitfalls. And that's where policy deployment comes in. So what is PD? Well, first of all, it's a leadership process. It makes sense that if we standardize the way things are done on the shop floor or in the office, we can also get some of those same benefits when we use a systematic method when leading an organization. And one of the primary things that the process of policy deployment delivers is turning a sometimes vague strategy, the what, into a very specific set of actions, the how. But the key to these actions is that they can't be one-hit wonders. They have to result in sustainable processes that lead to a new way of doing business. But policy deployment goes further than that. It takes those actions and breaks them down into specific things for people throughout the organization to do. So no matter what level of the organization you are or what your function is, you'll know exactly how your tasks contribute to the company achieving its strategy. I would like to make one point about this image of the waterfall, though. It has one major shortcoming. Waterfalls only flow in one direction. But in policy deployment, the information also flows upstream. So what ends up happening with policy deployment is that it becomes something of a compass and a map all rolled into one. So as the year progresses and unforeseen problems come up, you can bounce them against your policy deployment and have a bearing to your true north for the company. Let's talk now about the benefits of using policy deployment. One of the biggest things that an organization gets from policy deployment is the alignment of its efforts. That's not to say that everybody will always be working on the same things together, but because of the systematic communication, you will be very unlikely to come across competing agendas, and in most cases the goals will be complementary. And keep in mind that this alignment is not just vertical, it's also horizontal. Policy deployment drives a great deal of cross-functional cooperation. Another big benefit of policy deployment is that it creates buy-in. And one of the ways it does this is by making goals appear achievable. When you break big goals into manageable chunks, people are much less likely to feel overwhelmed. Of course, breaking things apart only works if you can put them back together. The structured approach of policy deployment will give you confidence that completing all of the frontline action plans will mean that the company will hit all of its top-level goals. These next three benefits are all closely related. Of course, the communication that policy deployment requires is a benefit in and of itself. But it also does two things. It provides a channel to talk about the allocation of resources, to make sure that they're distributed fairly and that people are not overloaded. And that fairness, that sense of everybody contributing evenly to the goals of the company, creates a much stronger commitment to the strategy. It creates a much more robust buy-in from people all across the organization. And finally, you will find that policy deployment begins to act as something of a filter. Obviously, you have to do the things that are on your action plans. But just as importantly, you'll find yourself avoiding the things that are not on your policy deployment matrix. This will keep you from getting spread too thin throughout the year, and it will help you avoid getting distracted by minor things.
I hope you are getting something valuable out of this video. If you want to get more out of this program, we recommend watching it on Valaction Videos. You'll be able to watch the entire video, mostly ad-free, and view subscriber-only programs. You'll also have access to a load of continuous improvement downloads.
Before you can use policy deployment successfully, though, there are a few things you have to lock down. The first is that the corporate values have to be clearly defined. These are the guiding principles of how the organization will conduct itself. This is particularly important because the organization will be looking 3 to 5 years down the road. The world changes very rapidly. If you don't have your pillars in place, the company cannot stay the course. The second prerequisite is that the company has to have a clear understanding of its vision. It has to know what its general strategy is. Think Walmart versus Nordstrom's. Both of them have regular initiatives that they do, but neither one of them strays very far from how they do business. And finally, for policy deployment to work effectively, you have to have a crystal clear understanding of who your customers are. As you'll learn a little bit later, policy deployment looks 3 to 5 years into the future. It's virtually impossible to predict what your customers will need in half a decade if you don't even know what they want now. So now we've covered a lot of the background about policy deployment. It's time now to actually talk about the steps of it. As I mentioned earlier, policy deployment looks quite a few years into the future. By having the prerequisites in place and understanding where the company is going, it is possible to create 3 to 5 year breakthroughs. But rather than try to accomplish everything at once, we just focus on the next year's work, and we call that an annual breakthrough. And to hit that annual target, we have to have changes in how we do business. These changes are known as improvement priorities. Now, if you've been around Lean for more than a day or so, you know we want to measure things. To make sure these new processes are working properly, we establish targets. We also designate a specific individual to have responsibility for those targets. Of course, no plan is good unless it's actually put into place. Policy deployment is not just about making the plan. It's also about following it and making sure that you actually implement the things that you say you're going to do. One thing that many people recognize when they're learning about policy deployment is that it closely mirrors the PDCA cycle. PDCA stands for Plan, Do, Check, Act, and it is just a methodology for getting to the bottom of a problem. Similarly, policy deployment is a very structured problem-solving methodology also. In fact, you could take the PDCA cycle and overlay it on top of the policy deployment steps I have shown on the screen. Granted, the majority of the steps actually fall into the plan phase of PDCA, but the bulk of the time in a policy deployment cycle is actually spent executing the plan, and that's where the Do, Check, Act portion of PDCA falls. One thing to remember, though, is that policy deployment is the most important PDCA cycle in your company. If you get policy deployment wrong, it doesn't matter how effective you are in other PDCA efforts. You'll just be doing unimportant things well. Successful policy deployment requires participation from people at all levels of the organization. Typically, in every company, executives are the ones making strategy. In a lean company, the same holds true, but there's more to it than that. Remember earlier when we talked about not having top-down strategy deployment? To avoid doing that, executives need to bring in the middle management, the layers of leadership beneath them, to make sure that they all have input on where the company is going. Even more important to policy deployment, the senior leaders of the company need to let go of the reins when it comes to goals and breakthroughs and improvement priority development. Middle managers are much closer to the process and probably have a much better understanding of what the company needs to do differently to accomplish the strategy. That's not to say that senior leaders should be hands-off when setting goals, but they should put some trust into the people that they've selected to run the day-to-day operations of the company. One of the things that effective policy deployment does is that it creates a very high demand for Kaizen activity. Doing more of the same just won't work. The result of that higher demand, though, is that middle managers will be strained for capacity. They will have to rely heavily on frontline leaders to make the actual changes to processes that will result in the company hitting its targets. One of the byproducts of all of this higher level focus on policy deployment and continuous improvement is that the senior leaders of the company are less engaged in daily management. That function moves down to the frontline employees and frontline leaders. This is, in fact, one of the biggest stumbling blocks of implementing policy deployment. Leaders have a hard time letting go of the daily operations and focusing on improvement. Until they start trusting the people doing the daily operations, they just won't have the time to effectively implement policy deployment. Now, assuming all of your prerequisites are in place, the first step of policy deployment is developing 3 to 5 year breakthroughs. Let's start with an example of a 3 to 5 year breakthrough that most people are familiar with. A classic example of a long-term breakthrough like this is when John F. Kennedy committed the United States to landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And what exactly made this a breakthrough objective? Well, first of all, it required a substantial process change. And that's not just to say developing the spacecraft. There were also many mundane processes that had to be created, such as developing a way to fund the program. The key point, though, is that the processes to get a person from the Earth to the moon and safely back simply did not exist. The second characteristic of a breakthrough objective is it has to have a really big impact. You probably don't need to be eliciting spit takes from this, but you should at least make people have an audible gasp when they hear how far you want to take the company. Breakthrough objectives also require collaboration. Because of the size of the gains that you're looking for, a single organization within the company can seldom achieve those objectives on their own. This next one, that it must benefit the customer, seems like a no-brainer. But it is always good to bounce what you're doing against the needs of the customer and make sure that what you're doing will increase the value you deliver to them. Think of it this way. If the customer can't see it, it's probably not a breakthrough. And it follows that if you do something that greatly benefits your customers, the competition is not going to like it very much. They should quiver when they hear about what you're about to accomplish. Now, this last characteristic often throws people for a loop. Most people in business are not accustomed to being told that a 30% failure rate is okay. The reason I push for this is that if a breakthrough objective is too easy, you don't really have a breakthrough objective. But you should be hitting many of them. 70% is a good balance that forces aggressiveness in the goal setting, but at the same time makes people feel comfortable that they're not constantly at risk of losing their jobs because of failure.
As part of the Lean training system this video comes from, we offer a variety of Lean Lego training packages. These include our Lean Lego flow simulation, mistake proofing or poka-yoke Lean Lego exercise, and our visual controls and 5S Lean Lego exercise. We've also got an office flow simulation for those not implementing continuous improvement on the shop floor. Click the links in the description below or click on cards that pop up on this video to learn more. We'll also add links at the end.
The drawback of having a 3 to 5 year breakthrough objective, though, is that it is daunting. Big goals can overwhelm people very easily. But if you slice that 3 to 5 year breakthrough up into annual breakthroughs, it's much more palatable for most people. Now, that's not to say the annual breakthroughs are going to be a cakewalk. They are still going to be challenging. Another characteristic of annual objectives is that they are nearly always numerical. Most 3 to 5 year breakthrough objectives also are quantifiable in nature, but on occasion you will find a conceptual one. Think back to Kennedy's quest to land a person on the moon. While the ultimate objective was not quantifiable, it is certainly easy to see how you could come up with an annual breakthrough that's numerical in nature. I also recommend front-loading your annual objectives. Don't just split a 3-year breakthrough into thirds. What you will find is that the more you can get done early in the life of the 3 to 5 year breakthrough, the greater your chance of success. One of the reasons is that the more you get done early, the more of the uncertainty you uncover and can deal with. There's also a practical reason to it. Leadership changes rapidly in many companies. The closer a project is to completion, the easier it is to hand off and the less likely it will be to lose resources. Because annual breakthroughs are stretch goals, you will be unlikely to know exactly what needs to be done to accomplish them. After all, if you knew what to do, you would likely have done it already. Another characteristic of annual objectives is that there is an immediate need to accomplish them. You're not looking to the future to figure out what to do. You need to do it now. Policy deployment is not a parking lot for good ideas. It is a way to turn those ideas into action. So anything that makes it onto your matrix has to be worked on immediately. The logic behind this last characteristic is also easy to see. If you do policy deployment every year and you have 3 to 5 year breakthrough objectives on it, some of those are going to be starting this year, some will start next year, and some may have started 3 or 4 years ago. There is a constant churn of the 3 to 5 year objectives, which means that the 2nd and 3rd and 4th year annual breakthroughs will also be in a state of flux. Simply put, policy deployment does not start fresh every year. It builds upon the previous year's strategy. The true differentiator between policy deployment and other methods of developing strategy is that policy deployment creates improvement priorities. And that's because improvement priorities focus on the driver processes. Rather than just saying the result you want, policy deployment requires a sustainable process to be developed to continue getting that result over and over and over. Let's think about how this would look for Valaction for my website. Let's assume that my annual breakthrough was to improve my website traffic from Y to Z. Instead of just identifying some events that I want to do, I have to actually create processes that will continue to deliver those results year after year. In my case, instead of just buying advertising, I would look at the processes behind things like my outbound marketing, or how I develop content that I post regularly to my site. Having the processes in place is what makes policy deployment so powerful. So the improvement priorities are the how, and they come from these annual breakthroughs, the what's. The question then is, how do you go from an annual breakthrough to these improvement priorities? Well, you do it by doing root cause analysis. If you look at an annual breakthrough in reverse, you can ask the question, why aren't we at this end objective? So if you treat it like a problem and you apply problem-solving tools like the 5 whys, or cause and effect diagrams, you can come up with the processes that are at the core of the problem. And the beauty of policy deployment is that there's a linkage between these processes that you can change and the annual breakthrough objectives that you're looking at, and that again links back to the 3 to 5 year breakthroughs. So if you change these processes, you will hit your 3 to 5 year breakthroughs. One thing that does trip people up is that they try to put metrics in as their improvement priorities. Now, improvement priorities, because they're process related, they are measurable, but they are not in and of themselves metrics. And finally, make sure that the improvement priorities you set are easily understandable. A lot of people will be looking at policy deployment matrices once they're developed. There should not be a large need for explanation of what the improvement priorities are. With the improvement priorities established, it is now time to set your targets. This is a bit different from how most strategies are developed. Without a refined process like policy deployment, people frequently jump right to target setting without a real understanding of how those targets will link back up to the strategy. But the methodical process used in policy deployment makes sure that the targets you come up with, when you combine them all together, they add up to the annual objectives. And because these targets are coming out of an improvement priority, they are linked to a process, and that makes them actionable. You set your targets based on what the process delivers, and the process in turn delivers the annual breakthrough objective. When setting your targets, try to stick with this format. You don't have to, but it conveys a great deal of relevant information very concisely. It tells you where you're starting, where you want to go, how big of a gain it is, and when it has to be completed by. Remember, all the different moving parts of policy deployment interact. That means the completion dates of all the different projects are very important because other projects depend on them. Another important point about setting targets in policy deployment is that they can't be done by a single person. Managers and their subordinates throw the targets back and forth until they agree on the magnitude of the change. This is very important because working together like that helps build consensus, and that consensus builds commitment. Finally, every single improvement target has to have an action plan to go with it. The action plan throws a dose of reality onto the target. If the responsible person can't come up with a plan on how to hit the target, either the target is too aggressive or they don't have enough resources and help. I'm going to say this again. There are a lot of people relying on each other in policy deployment. If one person doesn't hit their target, the rest of the plan, the rest of the whole strategy for the company can fall apart.
Get more out of our Lean Training System videos with our Continuous Improvement Companion. It's closing in on 1,000 pages of great content. It is currently available as a download with a subscription to Vlaction Videos and as a license through our store. You can also get a free version of it by signing up for our newsletter. Click the links in the description below or click on the cards that pop up on this video to learn more. We'll also add links at the end.
Setting improvement targets is great, but they're not worth the paper they're written on if there's not a person assigned to make sure that they are accomplished. Now, even though the assignment of responsibility is listed after the setting of targets, the two things go hand in hand. The person who is going to be tasked to do the project needs to be in agreement. They can't just be handed a target. Policy deployment is also very powerful because it coordinates effort. Think of all the leaders in a company like lifeguards on a beach. They all have to be watching their own sectors to make sure there's full coverage. If everybody's focusing on the same thing, in the company, you'll leave projects uncovered, and on the beach, there's a big safety risk. These last three characteristics are all about creating balance in responsibilities. You don't want any leaders overwhelmed with a glut of improvement priorities. You also want to make sure that there is a very clear hierarchy of who helps who and who is in charge. Even though policy deployment is very complicated and detail-oriented, there is a tool, fortunately, that is available to help you manage this process. It is called the Policy Deployment Matrix. You may also see it referred to as the X matrix. Like all forms, I highly recommend you make sure you fill out the header information. And the form I provide on my website, www.valaction.com, also lets you add customization by putting in your own corporate logo. The Policy Deployment Matrix is designed to show the linkage between all the different steps in the policy deployment process. The 3 to 5 year breakthroughs go on the bottom of the X matrix, and the annual breakthroughs go on the left-hand side. The layout of this form makes the connection between the different steps of policy deployment highly visual. To accomplish a single 3 to 5 year breakthrough objective, you may have a few annual objectives that go along with it. For consistency purposes, I like to put the most important breakthrough objectives towards the middle of the chart. The eye tends to be drawn towards the center, and as people start reading, they'll see the most important things first. I'm often asked how many breakthrough objectives, the 3 to 5 year type, should an organization have? Well, it really depends upon the size of the organization and its ability to get things done. So a more sophisticated company, when it has been around lean for a long time, may have more. But as a general rule of thumb, I like to tell people no more than 3 to 5, maybe half a dozen if you're a bigger company. The problem is, the more breakthrough objectives you have, the more diluted your efforts become. But even with just a handful of 3 to 5 year breakthrough objectives, you tend to accumulate quite a few annual ones. The small grids in the corners of the X matrix help reduce the confusion that can come from having several annual objectives linked to just a few 3 to 5 year breakthroughs. The connection shown by the black dot is unmistakable. When the whole grid is filled out, it is very easy to see how the different objectives link to each other. The improvement priorities continue to wrap around the X matrix and are entered at the top of the page. And again, the grid in the corner connects the annual objectives with the improvement priorities. The targets complete the loop on the right-hand side of the X, and again, they connect back to the improvement priorities in the small grid. The policy deployment matrix also has a location to put the names of the key leaders who will be responsible for completing the improvement priorities. And like all of the other parts of this form, the connections are again shown with dots on the grid. One thing about the connections, not all linkages are created equal. Some are stronger than others. Remember, policy deployment is intended to be a collaborative approach to meeting the strategy. Being able to show different connections helps with coordinating all the different moving parts that go into policy deployment. On the form that we provide at valaction.com, the primary relationships are shown by a solid dot, and the secondary or support relationships are shown with an open circle. The PD matrix is set up so that you only have to type an L or an M to show those dots. So let's put all these moving parts together and take a look at a completed sample policy deployment matrix. Note that this says 2012 top-level policy deployment. The company-wide strategies are generally considered top-level. One of the things that policy deployment does is it lets you create a second or third level policy deployment matrix. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The next thing to look at is the heading information. Note that as the founder of the company, I have my name up there as the owner of the top-level policy deployment. And I also have the revision date noted. Because policy deployment is a living, breathing document, there will be many changes to it as time progresses. Make sure that the date is updated so people know they're working on the most recent copy. So let's walk through Valaction's strategy. The first 3 to 5 year breakthrough is rather straightforward. We set a sales target for 3 years down the road. In addition to sales revenue targets like this, you may see a profit target or a profit margin target. It's not what the target is that makes this a breakthrough, but how aggressive it is. Challenging targets require a shift in thinking. Depending upon the business that you're in, you may also see something a little bit more unique. Now in this case, the number of visitors does have an impact on sales, but we thought it was important enough to make a distinction between the two different 3 to 5 year breakthroughs. Businesses are complicated. There may be some overlap in your breakthrough objectives. The final breakthrough objective is qualitative in nature. That's okay. As you do your annual breakthroughs, you will start applying numbers to it. And you'll be setting numerical targets for your improvement priorities. The important thing, though, is to know that you have something that's a stretch. It's something that is going to be a big breakthrough that's going to change the way the company operates. Annual breakthroughs, though, should contain numbers. When you are looking 3 to 5 years out, a conceptual grasp is okay. When you're talking about the next 12 months, though, you want to have a very clear understanding of what success looks like. And in most cases, success is defined with numbers. As a reminder, make sure that the first year slice of a 3 to 5 year breakthrough is the biggest. You should get the lion's share of the work done early. As a final point on this section, note that there is a subordinate relationship between some of these targets. In this case, you can tell that we intend for some of our sales goals to be accomplished with our partnership programs. As we continue around the X matrix, you can see how the dots link the 1 year breakthroughs to the improvement priorities. Now I want you to take a close look at the improvement priorities and see if a particular word stands out. Improvement priorities have to result in something sustainable. Even with the improvement priorities here that don't specifically say process, you can read into it. Making these permanent changes require a shift in how we do business. But even though the improvement priorities don't have numbers associated with them, we still measure them. And to do that, we have to establish improvement targets. Note the format of the targets. From X to Y by Z. Try to stick to that format as much as possible. Of course, a target is no good unless somebody is responsible for it. Note that every single improvement target has a black dot associating it with a single person who is in charge, a person who has the primary responsibility of hitting that target. That person may be getting some assistance, there may be resources assigned, and those are shown by the open circles. But remember, one person has to be assigned to be the single individual in charge of each of the improvement targets. And speaking of improvement targets, one of two things has to happen for every target. The person responsible for it has to create an action plan, or it's broken down into smaller targets on lower level policy deployment sheets.
This video comes from Velaction's Lean training system, which takes a module-based approach to learning about continuous improvement. Modules include a PowerPoint presentation and student guides for every video, plus there are many exercises and quizzes as well. There's also a whole host of supporting content in the form of terms in our Continuous Improvement Companion and downloadable articles. Our modules are currently available in our store and as downloads at Velaction Videos. Click the links in the description below or click on the cards that pop up on this video to learn more. We'll also add links at the end.
That's one of the useful things about the layout of the policy deployment matrix. It's very conducive to cascading the breakthrough objectives down to lower levels to subordinate organizations. Note that there is no 3 to 5 year breakthrough objective on the second level policy deployment sheet. Those are reserved for the top level PD. So, on a second level policy deployment matrix, the 3 to 5 year breakthroughs fall off and the annual breakthroughs rotate down to the bottom. Likewise, the top level improvement priorities rotate to the left-hand side of the second level PD matrix. Obviously, you'll do some screening and only the applicable breakthroughs and improvement priorities will rotate around to that particular subordinate leader. In the case of the sample in the previous slide, there were 4 vice presidents listed. You would most likely see 4 second-level policy deployment matrices. In addition to the X matrix, there are a few other policy deployment forms you may see. The first is the action plan. You should have one of these for every improvement priority that does not cascade down any further. In fact, the top of this form specifically calls out the improvement priority it is associated with. As a document that will be changed over time, it is also important to make sure that the revision date is accurate. And in addition to having an accurate revision date, you also want to schedule the next time that this document will be reviewed. Typically, this will be at an operations review or a policy deployment review. The general heading information is pretty typical of an action plan, as is the space for action items, owners, and due dates. A little less common is the color coding of the status. This action plan does have a few unique features to it, though. The first is the tracking matrix. The original plan is highlighted in gray, and an X is placed in the box as the action item is completed. This gives a very quick visual reference of how the plan is progressing. And finally, because the action plan is linked to an improvement priority and every improvement priority has a target associated with it, it is important to show the running impact of the action items. This serves two purposes. The first is to spur critical thought during the planning process. The impact of the action items has to be considered. The second reason is that the running impact acts as mileposts to chart your progress. And that progress is tracked on a policy deployment bowler. Having that running impact on your action plan throws a dose of reality onto the targets that you put onto your bowler. Instead of just pulling numbers out of a hat, your action plan tells you where you should be. The numbers from your plan are placed on the target line. Now, it might seem like this goes without saying, but every target on a policy deployment matrix should end up on a PD bowler. Be sure to mark the units and the starting point for each target. And of course, don't forget to fill out your header information. Now, the place where the rubber meets the road is on the actuals line. Every month, you should be having an operations review or a policy deployment review depending on the level of the organization. The PD bowler should be filled out prior to that meeting. The status of the metric should be color-coded according to the key. Any miss in red should be countermeasured. That's really the purpose of the policy deployment reviews. It gives the entire leadership team an opportunity to look over the actions and see if there's any collaboration that's required. The prerequisite to fill out the PD bowler, though, is that you have to actually execute the plan. Ideas only get you so far. At some point, you have to actually launch that rocket if you want to land on the moon. Specifically, all of the people with responsibility dots on the policy deployment matrices have to implement their action plans. But successfully implementing those plans requires resources. Remember, policy deployment is about stretch goals, and stretch goals are not easy. They are demanding and require a great deal of time and energy. If the action plans are treated as side projects, they simply will not get done. But even throwing time and energy and commitment at an improvement priority is not enough. To be successful, you also have to throw some skill at the problems. And in policy deployment, this often means continuous improvement tools. Successful policy deployment requires liberal doses of things like standard work, poka-yoke, and daily management. And that's another big benefit of the policy deployment reviews. There is a wealth of knowledge and experience in those meetings. If you don't know the specific tool that can help with your problem, somebody in that room probably will. Now at this point, you may be thinking, this policy deployment thing sounds like a lot of work. Well, you're right, it is a lot of work. It's work with a high return, but it's work nonetheless. Most companies will start their strategic planning in the back half of a year. Keep in mind that during the strategic planning period, you're working on next year's plan while you're implementing the current plan that you actually developed the previous year. As strategic planning winds down, Level 1...
Thanks for watching this extended free version of our Lean Training System module video. If you want to watch the whole video, check it out at Action Videos. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next LTS video that we post, please be sure to subscribe down below. We also always appreciate likes as it helps us get viewed more and makes us keep adding additional content. Thanks for watching, and best wishes on your continuous improvement journey.